Hello, it's Dr. Gibson. Welcome to our Module 2 video, Hypothesis Tests and Dependent T-Tests. Our main points or our highlights for this one are the two hypotheses of a hypothesis test, hypothesis tests, T-tests, and then dependent T-tests. The two hypotheses of a hypothesis test. So the first step of a hypothesis test is to break a research question or possibly a claim of some kind into two hypotheses, all right? So at the start of a hypothesis test, you're either going to have a research question or you might have a claim. In our case, we're going to have research questions. And you want to break it into two logically complementary hypotheses, okay? That's the way it always starts. The first hypothesis is that there is no difference between whatever groups are being tested, or if it's a test about relationships, there's no meaningful relationship. This is called the null hypothesis. It's often written H sub 0, where 0 is null. All right. The second hypothesis is that there is a difference between whatever groups are being tested, or if it's a test about relationships, that there is a significant relationship. All right. This is called the alternative hypothesis, written H sub A, or the research hypothesis, written H sub R. All right, so now full-fledged all the steps of a hypothesis test. Now, all quantitative statistical tests are hypothesis tests, all right? So this is a foundational, definitely a foundational item for what we're doing in this class. First, you're going to take your research question and rewrite it as a null hypothesis, an alternative, or a research hypothesis, whichever you want to call that second one. Then you want to take a closer look at the null hypothesis and find out what distribution is involved, what distribution is your data following what you're null doing, all right? And we're always going to assume that the null hypothesis is true. We do this because it turns out we have to make some sort of assumption in order to be able to generate the statistics we need to run these tests, all right? So that's the one we make. What we actually really assuming is that the equality part of the null hypothesis is true. Now, step 3, you're going to use this distribution that the null is following to determine a cutoff score for rejecting the null hypothesis. The cutoff is usually where there is a 5% or less chance of incorrectly rejecting the null hypothesis, right? In other words, another way to say it is where there's basically to get data like you've got is 5% chance or less if the null were true, all right? Step 4, now we've made our cutoff score, so we're going to use the data in the given sample to calculate an appropriate statistic. Step 5, we're going to compare the statistic from the data, called the test statistic, to the cutoff score. And then the last step is we make our decision. We either reject the null hypothesis or we fail to reject it based on how the comparison between the test statistic and the cutoff score will go. All right, that's our 6 steps. That's the way they all work. And again, all quantitative statistical tests follow this process. All right, so let's talk a little bit about t-tests. So what t-tests do is they compare the means of 2 data sets. The null hypothesis is that there is no difference between the 2 means, all right? So t-tests use a variation of the normal distribution, as a derivative of that variation, called the t-distribution, to determine whether the difference between the means is large enough to reject the null hypothesis. So that's, in general, that's the way t-tests work. This week, we're going to do a type of t-test called a dependent t-test. For the dependent t-test, data is recorded from the same group of participants at 2 points in time. So this is going to yield a before mean and an after mean, right? Now, a treatment of some kind has been applied to this group of participants at a point in time between the times when the data is recorded, right? So the before data is recorded, a before mean is calculated. A treatment of some kind is applied to the participants. And then sometime later, an after mean is, right, data is collected afterwards, the mean is calculated. What's really being tested is the effect of the treatment, right? So what happens at the end is if we can't reject the null that there's no difference between the means, then we say that the treatment did not have a statistically significant effect. All right. If we can reject the null that there's no difference between the means, then we're saying the opposite, right? That really, essentially, there is a statistically significant effect. Okay, well, that's it for the video. Now it's your turn. We're going to do some studying and workup, and you are going to perform your first statistical test. It will be a dependent t-test. See you next week.